Thomas Green here with the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. On the episode today, we have Tamara Soles. Tamara, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure, of course. So I am a child psychologist and the director of a center in Montreal called the Secure Child Center for Families and Children. And so I focus on supporting parents in connecting with their child and using that connection and brain-based strategies to help their children thrive. And I'm a mom of twins who are almost 9 years old.
Thank you for that. You mentioned about helping parents connect with their children. Would you like to elaborate on how you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my focus throughout my career has always been on children, but over the last 15 years, I really kind of focused in on how to help parents just reconnect with their child because so often they'll come to me and things have gotten to the point where they're really struggling with enjoying each other anymore. Parents are having a hard time with their child because it can be so draining when there are so many challenges. So I try to help them first kind of abandon the traditional parenting models that are certainly still in vogue in many places, including here in Canada. Um, Punishment, reward, timeout, those types of things, and focusing on what we know works and starting with that base, that foundation of relationship. And so I try to help them understand the importance of relationship in terms of discipline, and then how to help them reestablish that relationship, because it's not enough just to say, spend 15 minutes a day with your child. That's not going to do it when they're struggling. So it's about shining that spotlight in moments of connection and how do we build that out. And so that's kind of my job as I see my role is helping parents see those moments of connection and then expand on them, and to kind of take the pressure off of them to make these massive changes in their relationship right away and just focus on these tiny moments of connection that can be built upon. So it's something I love doing. I love seeing when parents start delighting in their child's presence more, because every child deserves that, and parents deserve to have that feeling when they're with their child. Of course, it doesn't happen all the time that we're with our children, but the goal is to reestablish that connection and that warmth.
Well, thank you for that. You mentioned in your answer that it's about what we know that works rather than perhaps the old-fashioned um, approaches. What would you, if you were to summarize that for someone in terms of what we know to work, how would you describe that?
What we know from research is that these traditional models like punishment and even consequences, particularly unrelated and illogical consequences, actually increase behavior problems over time. They are doing what I often call trading short-term gain for long-term pain, meaning that a child may become more compliant in the moment, mostly because they're operating out of fear or operating from a place of an attempt to avoid a punishment, but that doesn't actually increase both the relationship and that desire to cooperate, right? We want our children to make choices based on their own moral compass that we help them formulate, not based on whether there will be a reward or a punishment. So what we know from research is that that secure attachment and the ability for a parent to tune into a child's cues on a regular basis. It's not going to happen every time, but an overall pattern of what we call attunement is what really impacts a child long term. So we know that this long-term success, so to speak, for a child in terms of their later career, their academic performance, their happiness, their relationships, hinges on that attachment. And so that's what we know works. We know that that relationship-based approach works, and that when we can help our children make decisions based on what we've established as shared values and that connection, they're far more likely to develop those skills in decision making. And I should add to that that this approach is not just an absence of reward and punishment, but the focus is on skill building. So what we know works is when we teach people how to regulate their emotions, I'm sure you and I both know many adults who still struggle with regulating their emotions. It's not something that they're actively taught, even still, for many, many people. So we know that that works when we teach them how to regulate, how to notice the sensations in their body when they're getting agitated or anxious or angry, how to calm their nervous system, what strategies work besides count to 10 and take a deep breath, which is, you know, rejected by most kids usually when presented.
Mhm.
So we need to help them develop those skills over time and plant those seeds of regulation. So those are the things that we know work over time: self-regulation skills, relationship-based approach, and focusing on that attachment.
So just to make sure I understand the answer, the discipline, or not discipline, because that word is open to interpretation, but reward and punishment is replaced with better connection, would you say? And so those things are prevented from happening. Is that how you would word it?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things to keep in mind is that even when we have a very strong relationship with our children, they're still going to trip over their own development, meaning that they're still going to make mistakes, they're still going to have meltdowns, they're still going to, make a wrong choice. But we have a choice in that moment as parents where every step we make is either a step away from connection or toward connection. So in that moment when something has happened with my child, I can choose to yell and scream and send them to their room and take away an iPad for a week. What will happen is my child will be in their room stewing about how terrible I am, certainly not reflecting on their own behavior. But ultimately, it's still going to happen again. These That's not the way that children learn, generally speaking. And what it does is just adds more tension in a relationship and distance, which makes it even harder for a child to kind of want to please their parents, which most children do. And if they're not feeling that desire to please their parents, it's because there's something that's kind of gone amiss in that relationship. But the expectation, really, with this different approach is that we're accepting that reward and punishment are not good teachers. And the underlying principle is that children just do not have the skills yet to make good decisions consistently. And so, if we know that they don't have the skills yet, then punishment isn't going to work anyway, because punishment presupposes that they have the capacity to make those choices regularly.
Mm.
So if we're operating under the assumption that they don't have that skill yet, then the solution has to be supporting that skill building. So it's about debriefing later, talking about strategies. What can you do? Again, noticing those things in your body, using self regulation strategies. And it's a long game, which is the hard part of parenting, is that, we all of us want things that work right away. Of course, it's, much easier for not having meltdowns, or if, these big situations are not happening. But parenting is a long game, and regulating our own emotions is probably the hardest part of it. But we have to be able to do that in order to help them self-regulate as well.
Thank you for the explanation. Is this have you summarized what positive parenting is, or would you add more to that definition other than what you've explained?
I mean, I think that's essentially it. I mean, there's a lot of different names that positive parenting kind of goes by these days. We can call it positive parenting, gentle parenting, respectful parenting. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I'm less concerned about the name itself, because I think sometimes parents get so caught up in thinking that it has to be the specific set of rules. And really, it's more about just remembering to give our children grace in their development and expecting that they're going to make these mistakes. And our expectations play a huge role in how we respond. So I often liken it to a toddler learning to walk. So I'm expecting that my 15-month-old is going to fall often as they're learning to walk. Children are the same way in all aspects of their development. And so when they are learning to self regulate, when they're learning to wait for something or how to handle disappointment, they're going to fall. And we have a choice. We can either get really angry and punish, or we can validate their feelings, we can connect with them, and we can teach them, how to handle disappointment or how to wait for things. So it's a lot more labor intensive, but that sums up that approach, whether we call it, positive parenting or peaceful parenting. It's really the focus on the relationship as a vehicle to teach self-regulation skills.
Thank you for sharing that. And I do 100% agree in terms of, if you're expecting someone to do it or do a something, whatever it is, and they're unable to do it, to take something away or to discipline them is actually quite unfair. And that's
Yeah,
sort of I've got like a philosophical lens on these things. That's why I like to call it the peaceful parenting podcast, because, you don't discipline someone for something that they actually can't do. My
exactly.
question is, how would you differentiate between, let's say, something that they are able to do that they're not or unwilling to do versus they are unable to do something? How would you go about doing that?
That's a great question. So I see two potentially different angles there. So one is that often what happens for many parents, myself included sometimes, is that when we've seen our children do something many times, we assume that that means they're capable of always doing it. And that's not the case, right? So I may be very capable of resisting a chocolate cake on my counter, but if you put like Reese's peanut butter cups on the other side, it's going to be much harder for me. There's certain vulnerabilities that make it easier or harder for kids to engage in these strategies. And so that's one mistake I think many of us fall into often, is just expecting that if it's something that happens sometimes, that they're able to do it all the time. But of course, when kids are more tired, when there's more change that's happening, when they're hungry, when they've had a hard day, all of those things are going to affect their ability to engage in those more calm and sort of agreeable behaviors. But then there is a second set where certainly, for example, a child may be capable of going upstairs to brush their teeth, and you're asking them to go brush their teeth, and then they're refusing to go. So there certainly are those times. And that's a different situation. And I would say there can be a lot of different reasons why that is. Sometimes it's because the child is lacking a sense of agency, meaning a lack of a sense of control in their own lives. They don't have much choice over what happens in their lives. And children, certainly in traditional environments, don't have a lot of choice in their day. They're told when to wake up, when to go to the washroom, when to, eat, and so on. And so understandably, the more that we control them, the more that that counter will gets triggered, meaning that natural desire we all have as humans to have some sense of agency and control in our lives. So we'll push back against that control. So that could be at play for some people. And in that case, then we need to figure out how to provide some element of control for a child. So maybe they're choosing what order they're doing things. Maybe they're choosing, if they don't want to brush their teeth in the bathroom, they can do it in the kitchen, or some sort of variation that gives them a bit more of a sense of control. And other times it's because there has just become such a power struggle dynamic that has been created in a family, which is why I created my online parenting courses, No More Power Struggles. And it's really because so many of us fall into that dynamic, in which case the solution has less to do with what to do in that moment and more to do with how do we kind of think how we're structuring things so that we're not constantly engaging in these power struggles. So there can be a few different reasons why kids may not do things that they're otherwise capable of doing.
It's a great answer, and I particularly like the opening, because just because it's a simple task, as you said, they might feel tired, or and we all act differently as well. So it's
Yeah.
unfair of us to expect children to be super consistent when we may not be
Yeah.
either.
Yeah.
In terms of you mentioned your course, what what can you share from the course, and what could people expect to learn if they took it?
Yeah, so the course is structured in 6 video modules, and each module has its own set of videos. And I really try to encapsulate all the things that I usually do when I'm working one-on-one with parents. And I wanted a vehicle that allowed me to work with more parents than I can just in my private practice and in my clinic. So we really focus on some of the brain science of why traditional methods don't often work in the long term, and what we know about the science of what does work. Talk a little bit about attachment and how to connect. There is a whole module on self-reflection as a parent, because we also need to understand why we get triggered, because we all get triggered. I get triggered. I'm a psychologist, I'm a mom, and I'm triggered regularly by my children. But if I'm understanding a bit more about why I'm triggered, then I have a better chance of navigating that in a way that I hope to. But without understanding why that trigger happens, then I'm more prone to yelling or losing it. And most of us are going to lose it sometimes. The goal is not to be, the perfect parent. There's no such thing, as I'm sure you and I both would agree. But ultimately, that piece is a big piece. And then we have some strategies specifically about how to talk about self-regulation with your child. So we talk about, the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain, and how the downstairs brain is the more reactive part, and the upstairs brain is that prefrontal cortex that involves the planning and organizing and decision making and self-regulation. So they're learning about that piece. And then also some strategies about how to kind of develop a system for your family. So I often use a system that is a collaborative one that helps everyone in the family sit down and define what their values are. And this can be done with kids of really any age. And then what do we want our day to look like in terms of representing those values? And that adds a piece of, what are the expectations of them in the home? For example, if we value outside time, then that would be one of the things that would be included in, how we structure our day. So there's an element of using systems to help families run more smoothly. So there's that in there as well. And then there's just the tons of strategies specific to when this happens, when this happens, when this happens, when you ask them to do something and they're not listening, or when they're fighting with their siblings, how do you navigate those? So it's a little bit of an overview of all of those types of things that come up for almost all of us as parents.
Well, at least so far, anyway, you have had an impact on me in terms of perhaps where my focus might go. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. In terms of the what your approach would be in relation to if something goes wrong, in a sense, my interpretation is that you become a teacher, right? You're there to
Yes,
teach them how to behave. Now,
exactly.
this is the not so good part. I have perhaps relied on, let's say, if I ask my kids to do something, and the initial response is no, I will say something along the lines of, "You can say no to me, but I have done this for you. I've just done this for you. So in the future, the next time you ask me to do something, I might say no to you because you have just said no to me." Now, this is not quite I'm going to take something away from you because you haven't done what I asked, but it is kind of bordering on that. So, what are your
Adjacent.
thoughts for me there?
I completely get that. And also, I can be very frank with my children too. What I often say is that if if asking you to do all the things that we need to get done is such a hurdle every time, it depletes my energy. And if my energy is depleted, it makes it a lot harder for me to play, soccer in the basement with you later when we have a little bit more time after supper, or to do, the extra book with you at bedtime. So I'm very honest and transparent about the fact that all of these things take a toll when they don't go smoothly. And that is going to impact how much I'm able to show up in the ways that I want and that they want to. So in that sense, I feel like, I'm totally open about that. I think sometimes what we fail to do as parents is to try to understand the no's a little bit more. And, I think about if somebody, if I was doing work and someone just came in and said, okay, you need to stop and you need to come out here and talk to me now, I'd be like, I'm not finished what I'm doing. And so I try to put myself in their position as well. And it's not that if we just gave them 2 more minutes, it's always going to be the solution. It's certainly never that simple. But sometimes having a bit more, again, control over those parameters can be helpful in reducing that counter will. So again, I'm responsible for what is necessary and, setting those limits and expectations and boundaries, and I'm going to hold those. But is there wiggle room within that, right? To kind of help that. So if I say you have to go brush your teeth, it's not an option whether they brush their teeth or not, right? So they can't just fall on the no and be okay with that. That's not an option. That's not negotiable. But it might be negotiable if they, are just finishing X thing. And My son is really into doing these beating things, and, he's very focused. And if I asked him to stop that, in the middle, that is going to be hard. So, can I be a bit more flexible? Can 5 minutes make a difference? And sometimes as parents, we don't want to see that flexibility, but then we end up spending much more than that, arguing with them and being in that power struggle. So, one example actually had thought about the other day is a classic example of at the park. You're at the playground with your child, and so often we tell parents to give them transition warnings and 5 minutes, 2 minutes, whatever. But instead of doing that, what you could do is something like 15 minutes before you need to leave, ask them, "We're getting ready to leave. How much more time do you need?" And if they say 45 minutes, and you say, "Well, that's not, we don't have that time." So giving them some parameters where they get to choose. And okay, 7 more minutes, 8 more minutes. Okay, I'll set the timer in 8 more minutes. Again, there's small tweaks where they feel a little bit more empowered, but we're still holding that limit. We're still going to leave, and they're still not going to stay for 45 minutes just because they want to. But are there ways to just shift a little bit more, or use the collaborative problem solving approach, which is to say, we need to do this. I need you to do this. And you really want to do this. How do we solve this? How do we come to some solution? So again, we're holding that expectation, but giving them a little bit of leeway in how it gets carried out.
I like the preparation as well, in relation to the topics of like going to the park. So we're going to the park.
Yeah,
If I say it's 5 minutes to go, or something like that, are you willing to come out when I say it's time, or better
exactly.
language than that? If they say no, then you can actually say, well, next time you want to go to the park, maybe I won't feel that inclined to do it, or something along those lines. But
Yeah,
and also you
exactly.
mentioned the brushing the teeth thing. A lot of the times kids don't realize. I don't know why I'm saying this to you, because I'm sure you already know, but they don't know what the implications are of not brushing your teeth.
Yeah,
And so coming back to that teacher um,
yeah,
principle, they need to have someone explain to them what the implications are of not brushing your teeth. But
yeah,
I'm telling you
exactly.
stuff
Yeah.
you already know. So
No, I'm you're a preacher to the choir. I like it. It's all good.
you mentioned in one of your answers about, or I mentioned that the definition of discipline, when someone says the term discipline to you, I'm sure you've had this. And so how do you discipline children? What do you say in relation to the topic of discipline?
A lot of people are sort of afraid of the word discipline because it has such a negative connotation. I really feel strongly of trying to take back the meaning of that word, which discipline really comes from teaching. That's what the word really, that's the origin of that word, is to teach. And so I try to bring it back and not have discipline be the nasty D word, but that it really is a framework of teaching, and that is our role. So I try to embrace the term and help people redefine it, because I think, you know, many parents who are not coming from a peaceful parenting background or approach are really afraid of trying this different approach, because they're afraid that it means there isn't any discipline. They're afraid that it doesn't involve boundaries or limits, or it means that we're, you know, Snow White voice, with our children all the time, and that they just can do whatever they want. And that's not at all what it is. So I don't mind that word as long as I'm clear about how I'm defining it.
Have you got any thoughts about for people who, let's say, they love your approach, and they are quite happy to go with the long-term approach, be a teacher, but in the short term they're worried about what to do in those instances? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think many parents who are just sort of trying on this peaceful parenting approach really focus on the peaceful part, which is fantastic, but struggle with the limit setting part. And they don't know how to set the limits. And so that's where I think it's important um, for us to be able to talk about, how do we set those boundaries? How do we set those expectations so that you are helping your child learn, helping our child face frustration, deal with disappointment, having to wait, all of those things, because some parents will try to clear the path completely for their child to have this smooth road ahead. And that is not helpful to our children. They need to know how to manage adversity. Life is full of these bumps along the way. And if we smooth it too much and make everything gentle, that's not going to be helpful. And they're not going to have the tools that they need. But at the same time, we can be very intentional about it. And I think that's what's important about peaceful parenting, is that it's intentional. It's not meant to be reactionary, which a lot of traditional discipline is, right? Traditional discipline tends to be reactionary. It tends to be an authority grab where I need to reassert my authority because I'm feeling threatened in this moment because you're not doing what I'm asking you to do, for example. Whereas peaceful parenting is saying, I can be that lighthouse in your storm, and your storm is not going to take me down with you. And I can hold this boundary, and I can allow that meltdown to happen in my presence safely. I don't have to stop the meltdown. I don't have to stop the situation that might lead to the meltdown. So ultimately, we are in the moment still helping them navigate difficult situations, even though we are coming from a peaceful perspective. They're still learning, how to manage all of those things that we hope all of us can learn, because we want kids to grow up to be adults who can sit with their feelings and not escape them the way many of us as adults have tried at times to escape feelings, right? We want them to be able to know that there is space for those intense feelings and those big, overwhelming feelings, and that we're not trying to shut them down as parents, and that we can hold that space and then help them learn how to deal with it. So we really are, even in the moment, regardless of the fact that it's a long-term game, we are still, every single time that they manage to handle that disappointment or handle that no that we had to set, that is setting, them up for success both now and in the future. So there's a lot of present focus in it, even though the roots really take hold over time.
Yeah, also to pick up on something you said about the future, I actually think that being the teacher rather than being like an authoritarian is just going to have such a beneficial um, impact on the relationship that you have with your child also. So in terms
Yeah.
of what you would like in a parent, would you really want someone who's, telling you, I don't know, shouting at you or telling you can't do something, or teaching you? I think most people,
Yeah.
well, would know what the answer to that is. But I've
Exactly.
got what does it mean to parent the whole child? And I don't know what that means. So can you share with me?
Absolutely. There are so many aspects to a child's development that impact how they move through their day and the decisions that they make and their behavior that shows. And much of traditional parenting, and I say this as a psychologist who has many colleagues who are also still stuck in very behavioral approaches to working with families. And so we see this surface behavior and we think, okay, when this behavior happens, what do we do? And how do we, stop that behavior? But if we're not looking at what's underneath and what's causing that behavior, then we are going to fail. So one example that I use is a family that I worked with, where the child was always at the dinner table and was banging his feet on the chair legs, and incessantly and annoying everybody at the table. And they, like many families, would get into these like, you need to stop that. He'd stop for a minute and then start again. They'd warn him again. He'd start again. And then they would start counting and then threatening and then having him leave the table. But when we understand the whole child, we understand all the things that are happening from a nervous system perspective that might be influencing behavior. So, for example, if we think about sensory processing, which is how we take in information from our environment through various senses, most of us are familiar with the main ones, but there's a couple of others that most parents are not familiar with. So, the vestibular sense and proprioception, those are really important senses when it comes to how we move through the world. And those have to do with knowing where we are in space, and, taking in information through our muscles and joints. And a lot of kids are not what is called proprioception seeking, meaning they're looking for that deep input into their bodies. And many of us as adults are as well. We're just not aware of what's happening. So those of us who like, deep pressure massages or go for runs or chew gum, we're getting a lot of that proprioception, which helps us calm. It helps us stay regulated. People who bite their nails, sometimes it's another way of getting that proprioception. Um, Twiddling our hair. There's lots of things that people do to regulate themselves as adults, even though we're not aware of why we're doing them necessarily. And so in that example, that child was banging their feet incessantly against the chair because they needed some input. They needed some of that proprioception. So rather than getting into this power struggle and, counting and you leave the table, we put an exercise band around the legs of the table. So now he can still get his needs met of getting that resistance that his body was looking for without annoying everybody at the table with the sound of the incessant banging. So of course, they're not all as simple as that, but if we don't think about what is underlying a behavior, then we're going to miss the boat. And so parenting the whole child means thinking about all these aspects of them, like their sleep, like their diet. Have they been outside enough? Have they moved their bodies enough? And so many families that I work with are struggling with this disruptive behavior, I suppose is one way to put it. And because the kids are not sleeping enough, they're not moving their bodies enough, they're not outside enough, they're not connecting with their parents enough. We haven't considered the sensory component, for example. So that's what I mean by parenting the whole child, is that we really have to think about all facets, not just the observable behavior.
It is an excellent answer. And
Thank you.
I I mean, I have learned something again. And I didn't even realize that you could, I mean, your answer is obviously far better than this, but I didn't even realize that you could stop and just ask the question, well, why are they doing that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because one of my little ones kicks the chairs at the dinner table, kicks the chairs. And so my response to this is to move all of the chairs away so they're not within reach. But
Right.
you're essentially
Right.
saying that it's a developmental need, or it is because, for example, they haven't gotten enough exercise or something. And
Right.
so
It could
by
be a
getting
regulatory
angry at
need
them,
or
not looking at the why, you're doing something which is, again, it's unfair to them in the sense that you want to punish them when it's actually is part of normal,
yeah.
what's the
Yeah.
language you would use there,
No,
developmental
it's a typical
growth.
development, yes, and even if you're not punishing them, which is great, but if you're not asking that question, which many of us don't ask that question, right? You're not alone. Many of us don't stop and ask that question of why is this happening? Then we're just gonna be unsuccessful. Our solutions are not gonna be successful, right? So we're going to still see that behavior, and even if you move the chairs in that example, chances are it's gonna come out another way, right? So it becomes a little bit of that leaky bucket. And so until we figure out what actually is happening. For a lot of families, this may be different than your situation, but for a lot of families, for example, that transition to the dinner table is a tricky one. And often it's because many kids are going from a device, they've just maybe they finished their homework and then they've been given TV time or iPad time, and now they're being asked to transition to the table. And for most kids, that is a sequence that is setting them up to fail. We're now asking them to sit in a calm, regulated way to eat when they really needed to have moved their bodies beforehand. So even if you had them do 20 jumping jacks before coming to the table, chances are that's still going to be better than, just asking them to make that transition. So again, it comes back to what we talked about before, Thomas, of this understanding that children's regulation drives so much of their behavior. And what I mean by regulation, just to be completely clear, is being able to be in that just right zone where we are calm and engaged, but not overly active, but not underactive either. So it's in that just right zone. And again, as adults, we've hopefully kind of figured that out. If we're sitting in a conference and we're getting a little bored and we can feel our energy dwindling, we might get up and excuse ourselves and just go for a walk, get some water, and come back. So we're automatically doing regulatory behaviors in order to be in that calm alert state. But kids haven't learned that yet. And so if we are setting them up in this way without considering their regulatory needs, we're going to find ourselves in these power struggles or these situations where their behavior is just trying to accomplish what it needs without us examining the why.
Have you got any thoughts about anxiety in children in terms of, I know it's a generalized question, but in terms of perhaps common instances and things that you can do or someone could do to reduce that?
Yeah. In fact, I send out a weekly newsletter to parents, and the one that went out yesterday was about childhood anxiety because it is so common. I don't know what it's like where you are, but certainly here, the rates of childhood anxiety are increasing very much. And it's probably our biggest referral at the clinic is anxiety based. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. One of which is just that so much of our lives is chaotic right now, and kids are on the go so much, and they don't have downtime, and they don't have time to regulate. Their nervous systems are kind of in a heightened state a lot of the time. And then you add the fact that many parents, by necessity perhaps, are two working parents, and they're long days, and there's very little time. Kids are at school and then after school, and then maybe they have the most Canadian answer, then they have hockey later. So, there's so little time for that connection, and that parent-child relationship becomes more of a managerial role than a connection role. And so it can be hard to help our children stay in that, calm, safe state. And then on top of that, I think anxiety is one of those things that really triggers us as parents. It can be very, very hard to see our child anxious. And so there are very common things that we do as parents that accidentally make anxiety worse. So things like allowing avoidance to happen, right? So if my child doesn't want to participate in a school performance, and I say that's okay, you don't have to do it. I know it's too scary for you. I'm robbing them of the opportunity to learn how to face and feel that fear and then feel successful later to be able to say, yeah, I felt anxious and I could get through it. And with these tools, I was able to get through it, which teaches our brains that we can handle those things, even though they're scary. But when we allow that escape or avoidance, it actually builds anxiety more and more. So it can be tricky to know when to push and when to cushion them. But once a child is developmentally ready for these challenges, but it's anxiety that's getting in the way, we want to really support them to do that. And I gave an example years ago about my daughter really being petrified for no known reason of the music from Moana, the movie Moana. Don't know why, don't even know how it happened. But it became such a thing that if the song came on in a store, she would panic. And do I care if she ever watches the movie Moana? Absolutely not. I don't care. But did I address it with her? Absolutely. Because I want her to learn that the things that she's trying to escape from are things that she can learn to manage and tolerate. So we came up with a solution. How are we going to do this? And it was a stepwise solution. But often as parents, we struggle with setting up that, you know, ladder to help them manage it. So whether it's, being too afraid to go into their own room to get their pajamas at night because it's dark, for example, um, or sleeping alone for some kids. So there can be these things that we avoid doing because we don't want to, make our children upset, but we're robbing them of that challenge. So, that excessive reassurance or the avoidance and escape tend to be the things that kind of get in the way of a child overcoming that anxiety and, in fact, usually make it worse.
Have you got any thoughts around any sort of clinical literature or studies or something that has, let's say, most surprised you of late?
Oh, that's a great question. Hmm. I think this is a little bit perhaps off the immediate topic, but it's very relevant to a lot of the individuals that I work with. So I work with a lot of neurodivergent clients. And so that can be clients with a diagnosis of autism or ADHD, for example. And one of the things that we are seeing clinically that is bearing itself out in the research is the um, larger proportion of autistic individuals who are either gender creative, gender fluid, or that fall outside of the sort of binary gender um, notion. And I just think that's fascinating as if you're a parent who's supporting an autistic child, knowing that this, literature exists about the higher representation of gender non-binary or trans or gender creative kids within that neurodivergent community, I think is fascinating. It's really, really interesting research that we're still just learning about.
So you're saying it's more probable in those types of kids?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any were there any theories as to why, or
You
not
know,
go that far?
it's they're still kind of trying to understand it, but I think many of the self-advocates within the autistic community would say that if you are already operating in a system that doesn't fall prey to social, sort of random, arbitrary social norms, then the possibility is there to also not conform to a societal notion of this binary gender as well. That's one possibility, but there are other factors that they're starting to investigate. There's some indication in a minority of individuals that there may be a genetic biological component to it that has to do with some hormones and how genetically how predisposed they might be to something that is not assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. So it's still really just kind of new and being explored, but it is a fascinating area of research, I think.
Well, thank you for sharing it. Is there anything I should have asked you about today?
I don't know. We could talk about this stuff all day. I don't know. I love talking about, the importance of connection. And I just think that our children, it's so cliche, but our children are young for a short period of time. And the adage that the days are long, but the years are short is very, very true. And I think that when we allow ourselves to reframe discipline from that perspective of teaching and connecting, I think it's a more enriching experience for us as a parent as well as for our children. And it can be a very healing process. And I know that, I talked a little bit about the self-reflection piece, but when we understand our triggers as parents, it is very healing because we may be triggered because things that we did as a child would not have been tolerated, right? So if my child comes up to me and is whining about something, I may be triggered because if I was a child whining, maybe my parent would have slapped me, or maybe I was punished, or something like that. And so our brains and bodies have learned these patterns. And so I think sometimes it's an opportunity. It's not just about meeting our children from a peaceful perspective, but also meeting ourselves with compassion and grace. And so I really think that that parent component is so huge. And again, understanding that we are not going to be peaceful, calm parents all the time. That's not the expectation. But if we remember that the pattern is what's important, meaning that overall we're responding to our child's cues, more often than not, then we're in a very good position.
Well, there has been a theme around, let's say, improving the connection, or making a better attachment. So I suppose a good question to ask to close off with would be, if there is someone who thinks, yeah, I really could have a better connection with my child, what would your advice be in relation to how to start going about improving that?
I would say start small because again, we tend to avoid things that feel like really big tasks. So I like to think about tiny habits and tiny habits in all areas of my life, not just about parenting, but tiny habits. So is it that, maybe when I walk by my child, I'm going to just, run my hand along their back, or I'm going to make an effort to hug them in the morning, right? So I wrote an email to my network, my email network, about the research on hugs and what even 20 seconds of hugging can do to a child's, well, to anyone's brain. And so even small things like starting the day with a 20-second cuddle, or ending the day with a ritual of some kind, like saying the same thing every night, just being present with your child, trying to listen more than you talk. um, and one of the key, I think, um, tools, if you will, as a parent that we haven't been traditionally good at is validation, right? Meaning that I can say that a behavior is not acceptable, but in order for me to navigate that situation with my child, the first thing I need to do is validate the emotion. And so what I mean by that is, let's say my child was angry because his sister came and took the Lego out of his hand. He has every right to be angry about that. He can't go off and hit her as a result, but he has every right to be angry about that. So we need to start with validation. So even if you're going to just add one little tool to your tool belt as a parent, if that tool is validation, I think that goes a long way. And it can just be simple, saying things like, "That was hard, huh? That was really hard." Simple, simple, simple. Or, "You were mad your sister took that. I get it." Right? But often as parents, we say things like that, and then we add the "but" that just invalidates everything else. So if we just wanna focus on improving the relationship, even just with one small tool, I would say adding validation. So just acknowledging that feeling, and that can go a long way.
Tamara, I've loved the conversation. I think you brought some great knowledge along with you. If people want to connect with you or take your course, where do they go?
Absolutely. First of all, it's been a pleasure for me as well, and I thank you for this chance to chat with you. They can visit my website, which is drtamarasoles.com, and I also have some freebies on there too. So there's the course, but there's also some free handouts like hidden reasons why your child may be melting down, or how to handle perfectionism. So those are free on there as well, so they can check that out.
Well, thank you for your contribution in general, because I'm sure you having an impact on people's lives. So appreciate that, and thank you for being a great guest today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.